Good afternoon and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining Faith and Public Life Action for our final Coffee at the Capitol event in our series. Since the beginning of March, we've joined together weekly for discussions with faith leaders, community organizers, and movement partners to dive deeper into the core values of our faithful agenda and learn more about specific policies we can support to advance racial and gender justice. Today we'll be focusing on democracy reform, and I'm so excited to be joined by some incredible advocates and colleagues. And my name is Kelsey Herbert, and I'm the National Campaigns Director with Faith and Public Life Action. As folks are joining, please say hi in the chat. We'd love to know who's joining us. Feel free to put your congregation or your organization and where you're joining from. Back in February, Faith and Public Life Action launched our Faithful Agenda, which outlines our values and what we hope the Biden administration will prioritize in their first 100 days. And it's appropriate we're having this final conversation as we anticipate hearing from Biden tonight in his address to Congress. As people of faith, driven by our values of dignity, love of our neighbor, and justice, we are advocating for policies that center our communities, meet our needs, reflect our values, and remedy injustice. Our faithful agenda includes justice for Black communities and ending systemic racism, compassionate, effective pandemic relief for all, justice and dignity for LGBTQ people, dignity, family unity, and citizenship for immigrants, and building an inclusive democracy. We are thankful for everyone who has taken action with us over the past few months to ensure the Biden administration and Congress understands that the faith community is ready for big change rooted in justice for our communities. And now we can move into today's topic. Last week, we postponed this conversation on democracy reform to create more space for us to honor George Floyd and the hundreds of thousands of people who took to the streets to demand accountability and justice in light of the verdict last week. Black Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter to God. We know the struggle to fulfill the promise of a true democracy in this nation has existed since our founding. For far too long, communities of color have been excluded from our nation's democracy. But as people of faith, we are here striving for a true, faithful democracy where everyone, no matter your race, gender, religion, economic status, or national origin, has equal representation, access to the vote, and political power. Black communities have been leading the fight for a true democracy for generations and may have made it clear that democracy is a racial justice issue that we must all get behind. The House of Representatives has passed H.R. 1, the For the People Act, a hallmark democracy bill that will bring us one step closer to turning away from the wrongs of our past and commit us to a more just, inclusive future. It's currently in the Senate as S1, and today we'll hear from some amazing speakers about this legislation and others that, if passed, will transform our democracy. As people of faith, we believe all people have dignity and demand that our government recognize the inherent dignity of everyone in this country. Democracy reform is a necessary step in that direction, and we are in a moment where we can make this happen. So I'm so excited to bring in our speakers for this morning, this afternoon. And I'm going to ask each one of them to introduce themselves and answer a question. How does your faith motivate you to work for a faithful democracy? So first, I'd like to welcome Sister Quincy.
Hi, so happy to be here. Thanks so much, Kelsey. I'm Sister Quincy Howard. I'm with Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. And as a Christian, I think really I feel called, and I feel like we are called to really work towards the new creation, to build a better world. And the point of democracy is really to allow for that kind of redemptive spirit to come forward in our nation. When I think of a faithful democracy, I think of a fertile ground for making policy changes that do bring about a better world. So a faithful democracy would include inclusion of all people to be represented, representation of the people, as well as sort of the mechanisms needed to bring about better policies for a more just society. And I think that the redemptive spirit of our nation is something that's been built into it since the beginning, even with all of the fraught history and the legacy of white supremacy. A faithful democracy is really our primary tool to make a change and to find a new way to move forward.
Amen. We know we need a new way to move forward. Absolutely. Thank you. And I'd like to bring Andrea into the conversation now.
Well, Kelsey, thank you so very much for having me. I'm Andrea Miller, and I'm the founding board member of Center for Common Ground. When we talk about faith and we look at American society today, faith is the one area where, at least in theory, we share much common ground. Things begin to diverge when we get to, well, are we going to do this or are we going to do that? But our faith gives us that as faithful people with a belief in a kind, loving, and caring God, there are certain norms that we must believe. We must really believe in equality, racial equality. We must remove all those things that we say, well, you are less than because you are. No, there is an equality and a beauty and a love that God has for all of us. We are all made in his image, and our democracy must reflect that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And Adwan.
Thanks, Kelsey. Can you hear me? Okay, great. My name is Adwan Whitfield. I'm the Democracy Reform Organizer at Faith in Public Life. And really for me, as the Bible says, faith without works is dead. And correspondingly, works without faith is dead. And if you show me someone who has faith, then I'll see it through their works and vice versa. And so for me, democracy is the core of justice, right? Being able to allow those who are unrepresented or are not heard, having those people being able to participate in democracy is part of and living in this just world is part of what we are called to do. And so that's what motivates me. And thanks for having me today.
Thank you. And thank you all. Thank you for sharing your faith and how it motivates you to act for justice and work for justice for our communities. And so Sister Quincy, I'd like to bring you back. Sister Quincy works with Network Lobby and is also the co-facilitator of the Faithful Democracy Coalition, which is mobilizing faith communities across the country around different legislation. So Quincy, so grateful for your work. You truly are an expert in this. I'm curious if you could begin by sharing, what are some of the current gaps in our democracy that exclude people, which are making us need to work for democracy reform today?
Sure. So there's a laundry list, which can be really discouraging, but something that is helpful for me to keep perspective is to remember that despite the ideals that our democracy was built on and founded on, it was originally designed to be an exclusive system, to maintain power for a certain slim section of the society that actually lived here. So when you think about that as the starting point, it really shifts the narrative. And for me, it gives me hope that having seen the changes we have, we can continue to see these good changes be put into place, which is that redemptive spirit I referred to earlier. Some of the gaps in our current systems, many of them aren't intentionally trying to suppress the vote, but they leave a lot of room for some shenanigans along those lines. So I would mention, first of all, we saw in 2020 with the patchwork election systems that do bring their own strength, and there's a reason they were designed that way. But in the complexity these days, it really can create vast disparities and barriers to casting the ballot based on where you live. So working class voters and voters of color are really most impacted when there are needless restrictions around voting in certain places. And so it creates this really intense disparity across geographic locations that can be confusing and it can be confounding, and it leaves a lot of room for the shenanigans I was talking about. Another gap is in representation, I think, is really gets at dark money and special interests, large donors that are really, it is a problem that is growing exponentially, and it's sucking the air out of our democracy currently. The voices of regular people are drowned out by money, which is considered free speech these days. And voices of voters are, we feel, and are increasingly becoming inconsequential when compared to this sort of almost like an arms race of how much money can go towards what messaging and how can you influence how people are going to view our politics. Campaign financing system is also very dysfunctional. It's all privately funded, and it makes running for office extremely challenging for candidates that aren't well connected from wealthy communities. So that is a major gap in people's participation. Gerrymandering is, as we know, partisan and racial gerrymandering manipulates the underlying system in how districts are drawn, to the point that people's vote in certain districts doesn't even matter because the cards are stacked against them and they know that, and it makes it feel pointless and is very discouraging. And I think also protecting the fundamental right to vote, which we saw in the Voting Rights Act, which has been gutted by the Shelby ruling in 2013, that the protections have really been stripped. And so that racist legacy that I got at earlier of suppression is really, there's a resurgence of that. And we are in a very vulnerable place as a nation, even as we're becoming more aware of these dynamics, that is rearing its ugly head and could become the name of the game again, moving us backwards by decades. I think another way that comes to mind that is just deeply unjust is that there are many states that still do not allow citizens the vote if they were formerly incarcerated. So even after they've served their time, they continue to be penalized for mistakes that they have made or unjust rulings that were made against them, and cannot participate in our democracy. And finally, voting by mail. This is a no-brainer. There are systems that are highly functional and make voting efficient, accessible for so many Americans. There is no reason that should not be universally acceptable for all voters.
Great. Well, you said a laundry list, and I know there's more in there, and it is discouraging. But we are in a really maybe a more hopeful moment right now. A chance where we can have some change. So I'd love for you to talk about the For the People Act, this hallmark democracy reform bill, and what are some of the most urgent aspects that this Congress must address to bring us to a more fully realized democracy?
Sure, thank you. The For the People Act is kind of, it's the movement of the spirit coming from a sister. That's how I characterize it, because its time has come, and the fact that it was first introduced in 2019 and is now available to us to respond to so many of the challenges that are reaching a fever pitch is a huge opportunity. I think of it as like the Affordable Care Act of democracy reform. It is a massive omnibus, and it is comprehensive and bold, and it's what we need. So some of the more urgent aspects that I want to point out of the three titles that it has, one of them is about election and voting reform, which we saw in 2020 is an urgent need. And now that there are many states that are using that original lie of massive voter fraud to then pass restrictive rules in their own states, what we need is a federal baseline standard for access to the ballot. And that's what For the People Act would do, is let voters across the country, no matter where they live, know what reasonable expectations are to be able to cast their ballot. So in many cases, with many of those states, it would preclude what the states are trying to do, because it would set a different standard, which is more just. Another thing that it would do, which is extremely urgent, is redistricting reforms. We know that the census apportionment data just came out this week, and the next step in that process is going to be for states to redraw their districts. We know that partisan gerrymandering is increasingly the norm in states and state legislatures who want to maintain their power. So that is the underlying rationale for drawing districts. It's unfair. People don't like it. And what For the People Act would do is to set up a process for states to follow that is independent of partisan intentions. So it lays it out clearly. It takes the partisanship out of the process, and it also bans partisan gerrymandering outright, in addition to setting up those reforms. So S1 has also addresses the growth of money in politics, which I mentioned. It's growing exponentially. It doubled between 2016 and 2020, the sort of donations going to influence our elections. And S1 would set up an alternative campaign finance system that empowers small donors, as well as setting up some strong disclosure requirements so that voters can know who's trying to influence the narrative and who's trying to influence how they vote. Really, disclosure is the only tool that we have left to us after the Citizens United ruling. And so it's critically important to be able to pass those reforms. And finally, I think just as urgent are the ethics reforms in S1. We have seen over the last 4 years that many of the ethical standards that we thought were law are really norms. And those need to be codified now. We have survived the last 4 years, and we need to make law what reasonable standards are for our elected officials in how they conduct themselves and how they represent the people.
Thank you, Sister Quincy. That was a really helpful explanation. You really are a champion for this legislation, especially among the faith community. So thank you for your tireless work. I appreciate you being here with us. Now we're going to shift a bit, and I want to bring back Andrea to this conversation. The For the People Act is one really incredibly important piece of legislation on the table now. We know there's other democracy legislation that will help advance voting rights and access and equal representation. So Andrea, could you speak to the history of the Voting Rights Advancement Act and why this important legislation is still needed today?
Thank you for that question, Elsie. As Sister Quincy described, the For the People Act will set some basic minimum standards for what all 50 states have to do. But what we saw immediately after the Georgia runoff election was this incredible collection of state legislation really deliberately trying to make it harder for people of color, for poor people, for rural people of color to be able to vote. So while the For the People Act sets the standard, this is what all 50 states must do. The Voting Rights Advancement Act basically says you will not be able, states that is, will not be able to introduce legislation that will suppress the vote of racial minorities, of language minorities, and for whatever reason, we tend to not think of the Native Americans and our Alaskan Native brothers as a minority, but they are a very unique and a very distinct minority. And their ability to vote has been very, very hampered by state laws. For instance, I believe it was in the 2018 election, there was suddenly a requirement in Montana, actually, it was in South Dakota, that residents who lived on the reservation had to have addresses. Well, in that state, residents who lived on reservations had never had addresses before. And suddenly that became a requirement in order to be able to vote. One of the other things that's very important to know about the Voting Rights Advancement Act is that this is really an amendment to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And up until literally 2018, we had never had a problem renewing and amending the Voting Rights. It had been supported by Democrats, Republicans. It was our one true bipartisan voting rights bill that we always supported. So the 1965 Voting Rights Act has actually been amended 5 times. And every time they amended it, they addressed a new problem that they were seeing in states. So, as you mentioned earlier, originally it was designed to make it easier for African Americans to vote. There was then a recognition, well, there are also language problems. America is not, most people speak English, not all. And so every citizen, if they are going to be able to exercise their right to vote, must have information in a language that they understand. When we're looking at voting, we're not really looking at basic conversational language. Hi, I want to buy this. How much is this? Anybody who's ever done a conversational level 1 language, it's very, very sophisticated. So language was critical. And then there was also the recognition, not only are Black people having challenges voting, but Hispanic folks, Asians, everyone that was not that original group where voting was truly a right, white Americans, people of other colors were having challenges. And they expanded it and they kept expanding it. And then one other change they made was originally the intent was the voter suppression needed to be deliberate. Well, that was very, very difficult to prove. People didn't introduce legislation saying, we are introducing this bill to deliberately make it harder for Black people to vote. Nobody said that. They modified and amended the language to say, if we end up discriminating and making it harder for a racial minority or a language minority to vote, whether that was your intent or not, then this is problematic and we are going to say, no, you can't do that. So I've rambled on. I'm going to tighten it down and say the new bill reestablishes the formula that they use for pre-clearance. So thank you, 47 states, for introducing voter suppression legislation, showing that within the past 10 years, you have attempted to discriminate unfairly against your voters. So now any new legislation you want to introduce that has anything to do with voting and elections will have to be pre-cleared by the Attorney General and Department of Justice.
Thank you, Andrea. You really made it clear that, no matter where you live, you deserve the right to vote and access to voting, and no state should be able to discriminate against people. And so it's really critical we have these broad protections for every 50 states, for people in every 50 states, to be able to vote and have equal access. And you also touched deeply on this being a racial justice issue, how from our founding and from our start. So thank you for highlighting that. And for all your work that you do in Virginia. And now I'd like to bring in Adwan. And we see, Andrea talked about Georgia. We know that there were, huge fights after the runoff election around democracy and voting. And we've seen this trickle to many other states, including Florida. And Reverend Warnock says, if you don't think, this is coming to a state near you, these voter suppression bills. And so we know that Florida has not escaped this. So Adwan is our democracy reform expert organizer in Florida. And so Adwan, I was wondering if you'd be able to, give us a sense of what is happening in Florida and what are the threats to democracy happening at the state and local level there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me again, Chelsea. Just as you said, some of the things that are happening in Georgia, that has happened in Georgia, is now happening as well here in the state of Florida. We are in our last week of legislative session here in the state of Florida, and we have seen a lot of bills that come across to threaten our democracy, to threaten the vote. And so the biggest one that we saw come across was a Senate bill. It's called SB 90. And that bill really tried to take away some of the vote by mail, the drop boxes. Now, what's ironic about this is that the governor, as well as many legislators after the election, came out and spoke so highly of our elections here in Florida. The elections in Florida was supposed to be a staple, was supposed to be an example for the rest of the country to follow. But now we see all of these bills trying to undo that great voting experience, the great elections that we had. And so we, was very confused about that. But nonetheless, SB 90 has already passed through the House, and now it's passed through the Senate. They passed it to the House, and it's on its reading for the House, and it looks like it's going to be it's actually going to be a bill. What's great about it is, we've done a lot of public comment. We've done a lot of things where, speaking out against this bill, and so they've changed some of this bill to where, our drop boxes are back. One of the biggest things that they had on there was that, when we got our vote by mail, we were told that your vote by mail request would be good for 2 years. Well, this bill took that away, right? So we would have had to educate our voters to ask for another vote by mail request, because they want you to do it now every single year, and they wanted to stop in the middle of the cycle. So we were able to fight and get that back into the bill, so we don't have to do it until after 2022 elections. And so that's one bill. And then we also have another one that's called SJR 1238. And what that is simply is they're trying to raise the standard to change the amendment to vote for an amendment change to the Florida Constitution. So right now, Floridians can vote as a whole and have 60% of the votes change the Constitution. Right now, we did that for the rights for restoration. We did that for Fight for 15. We did that to expand the Medicare, right? And so now they want to raise that to 66 2/3%. And so with it being at that threshold, anything that we just named, any of those things that we just named would not have been passed. And so those are the things that we're working on and we're fighting on continually. That bill still is up in the air. So hopefully we can kill that bill as well. And, we're just really trying to fight here. We do a thing every year called the Faithful Voter Program, where it's a turnout program where we reach out to congregations, pastors, and just have them get involved and make a promise to their pastor to vote. We see increased turnout in local congregations when we do that.
Thank you so much, Adwan. And if anybody here is from Florida listening in, please join us in the fight on the state level there. Adwan, just to wrap up, I was curious if you could share a story of a voter that you worked with in Florida in this past cycle that inspired you to continue in this work and fighting for a faithful democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did a lot of calls. We did a lot of calls during the summer, just letting everybody know about their options about vote by mail and what the differences was for vote by mail. And I talked to one particular lady who had no idea. She would always go in and she would always vote, but she had no idea the access, and not only the access, but the versatility of the vote by mail ballot. And so, you know, after we talked for a little while, you know, and I shared with her, even if she decided to go in and vote, you know, she can still request a vote by mail ballot and still go in and vote if she wanted to. But if anything arises, she had to use that vote by mail ballot, she could still do so. And so she ended up, you know, voting by mail for the first time ever. And, you know, it just, for me, it just rang out that it was important. You know, like there's a lot of people who don't know about their voting rights and what those are. So it really gave me the inspiration to just keep going.
Thank you so much, Adwan, for your work and for how your faith motivates you. So important, and so grateful for you and everyone in Florida and across the country doing this work on the ground at these state battles. And it really highlights why we need universal democracy reform. So in the chat, we're going to drop a link where you can take action and you can send a message to your senator asking them to support the For the People Act in the Senate. Like we said, this passed in the House of Representatives. It has gone through a hearing in the Senate, and it's now time that this bill gets advanced and gets passed this year. And we really need the support of members of the faith community from across the country to say that democracy is an issue of faith, it's an issue of racial justice, and it's an issue of human dignity. Everyone deserves equal access to voting, no matter what state you live in. And so these protections are critical. Getting money out of politics, gerrymandering reform. Sister Quincy touched on so many of the important aspects of the For the People Act. So hope you'll continue following Faith and Public Life Action and our work moving forward and the work of the organizations on this call. And we thank you all so much for your time and for joining us for these past few weeks at our Coffee at the Capitol. This is our last event in our series, and we're excited to share with you in the coming weeks our next campaign called Holy Recovery, as we look toward how we can, as people of faith, work towards shaping a true recovery for our nation. So thank you all so much for your time and for taking action with us. Hope you have a great rest of your day and your week.